things where I can see. All right, first one. As of yesterday afternoon, everything was graded except for the last assignment in the SQL class that was due before yesterday. Okay? I have not done any more transferring grades in the 4 Cisco classes, which includes y'all. I've got to do that, and obviously now I got a whole bunch more stuff to grade because every class had stuff due yesterday. Hopefully y'all turned in chapter 10 because as of yesterday morning, actually when I said yesterday afternoon, actually it was on Saturday afternoon when I got it all caught. As of yesterday morning, nobody had turned in 10 in all 3 sections of this class, which put me, when I saw it on Saturday and I went back and looked again yesterday, that I went and made sure the assignment was there. I was going, this is odd that nobody had turned it in, because usually there's somebody, because I've already got somebody that's 1 or 2 people have turned in chapter 11. So, and that's the way it works. And I had one complaining on Sunday that chapter 11 test was not open, which didn't open until yesterday, that hadn't done chapter 10. I don't know where they were. They just apparently decided to skip chapter 10 and go on to 11. So hopefully I can get that worked on through today. I'm really wanting to do that other one of SQL. I was needing to do it at school instead of at home, because I actually have to look at an answer sheet as I'm grading it, and it's easier if I'm using 2 screens to do it. So I put the answer sheet on one screen and what they did on the other screen. So that's the only reason that one hadn't gotten done. And then, so I want to get that done, and then I've got to get going on doing the next grading. I've got to do the work ethics for all the classes, and there's a couple of classes I got to review, and I've got to go back and look at that and see exactly which date they want that done by so I can get those done. Because I'm on a review committee of online classes here at the college, and we have to review a couple of classes, usually about 3 each semester, but they've got it down where it's a whole lot quicker than it used to be. So grading is up on that. Transferring grades is on my list to do, to get those transferred across, so that things will be pretty well set up for me week after next. Because then y'all's last chapter 11 is due next Friday, May 3rd. Your final exam is Saturday through Monday. And then I have to turn grades in by that Thursday morning, like at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or something. So all of that stuff's got to be done by then. The other part is I got to start working on summer, and I have not even touched that yet. So all of those, so I've got to get that stuff all done in there. Next week on Thursday, I will not be here. So we have no class next Thursday. We'll get 11 done today, as soon as I start on it in just a minute. And then Thursday, and if we need Tuesday, we'll do the cabling for the final lab. Okay? And I've got the onlines have got to come in and do that with me also. So that's going to put a little busier for the next 2 weeks too. And then, so Thursday I'm at Amazon. Wednesday, I'll probably be on this campus on Wednesday, actually, because I've got to spend from like 10 o'clock till 2 o'clock up at the Walker Civic Center for the Distinguished Service Award. I'm doing pictures for it, and Kiwanis are doing it, and I'm a member of that. So, and then actually I'll be attending on behalf of the school, because I'm sitting at the school's foundation bought a table at it, and I'm sitting at their table. So I'll actually be doing with school there, in actuality, that I'll be there as a representative of the school. And I'll be doing it actually as Kiwanian, which is actually public service for the school out there. So that will be part of that day. So we'll see what all happens. This doesn't phase y'all because y'all don't have to do discussions, but this is the last week the ones that are in my online classes have to do discussions or do collaborate. So after tomorrow night, I'm done with collaborate, so that frees me in the evening on that one, and I don't have that mixed in there next Tuesday afternoon either. Because those do take time, and grading the discussions takes a couple of hours each week on me to go through and read all of those posts in all 5 classes, I guess it is, 4 classes. To read them all and then pull out certain ones and put in a summary and post it back out to everybody, because I got to go through and look at every individual person's post. Now, I don't sit there and read their replies as a normal rule, although sometimes something in a reply catches my eye because I actually see the replies and the post when I'm grading. And I have to look down to find the post. It's at the bottom of the list. So sometimes as I'm looking on down to find it, there's something jumps out at me in one of them, and I have to sit there and reply to it because that it's something, either they made something really good comment or there's something off that I'm going, ooh, you better say something about this. So, and that just takes time to go through and read those and make comments back, even though I keep them short. That you still, so that's all going on in the next 2 weeks, this week, next week, and actually the following weeks, the next 3 weeks. So then grades have to be submitted by me, by all the instructors by, I think it's 10 that morning, it's usually like 10. And then usually it takes another couple of hours to get a couple of people in. They're able to contact me and tell me I need to contact this adjunct or somebody else. Or sometimes it loses some of my grades. And then I have to go back and repost it again. So that eats up Thursday for the registrar on it, and so supposedly they expect to have them all posted and that they can roll them Thursday evening, and then they'll be available to y'all on Friday. However, I will have everything in your classes correct by hopefully on Tuesday, for sure Wednesday, and that you can look at Cisco or Blackboard and see what your grade was anyway, because I'll have everything transferred in there. So hopefully by the end of next week, that by the weekend that I'll have grade chapter 11 graded and posted, and that I can have that all transferred. The only thing that I'll need transferring is the final exam, and if you had gotten that done by then, I may actually start transferring those a little on the weekend. So you may actually be able to see on Monday on it. So I have made progress. Okay? Now, so just remember Thursday we're doing cabling, and that you're going to go through and do the final cabling lab. Okay? As it is, I really don't have most of the tools with me anyway. They're sitting on my desk over on the other campus today. So we couldn't have done anyway. But we got chapter 11. Chapter 11 sort of summarizes in some way to the whole book. They've gone and tried to take a different look at the networking than they did through the book, because primarily through the book, everything was introduced to you in terms of large networks, is where they kept talking about. Of where you have hundreds or thousands of machines sitting out there. And so this chapter, they've tried to take it from a different perspective on it, coming back on some of the stuff. So most of the things in the chapter we've actually already talked about through the book, but they're just trying to give you a little bit of perspective from a small network. And notice in their illustration, they're thinking in terms of a really small network of one that's got just several machines on it, running on it, okay? So thinking about your offices around here or some of these smaller manufacturing plants around here, not Roper, but the other smaller ones that we've got different things of around here that where they've only got a small office in front of it and that they may only have 3 or 4 or 5 people working in the office that are on computers, and they may or may not have some equipment hooked to it, to the network back there, but that's the extent of their network. Where the doctor's office is, and where it's just 3 or 4 computers in the office all hooked together type thing. Or, in all of your cases, well, maybe not Christy, because you're on the dial-up, aren't you? But technically,
DSL.
huh?
I got DSL.
Okay. So she's got DSL, so she could fit into the category 2. And actually, I worked on a computer last week, just down the road fixed a computer for a lady that's using AOL dial-up. Okay? And it really wasn't working bad. And all she's doing is doing web pages and email. And the speed really was not that bad on it. I was surprised because I actually downloaded a couple of things on the machine. But they're at home that you've got small networks also, and that you may have that same number of devices sitting there. It's your phone may be hooking in on it. You may have a couple of computers hooking in on it, so you may have a couple of phones using the wireless from it and a couple of computers using on it. And so again, that you've got a network there also. Although for most people, they have no idea that's a network. Okay? Because they don't do anything about setting up a network on it, and now doing wireless on it, that for the people that really don't know anything, they've got no real perception in their mind that all these devices are hooking together to that box, although they are. Okay? So, small networks are everywhere. That's basically what I was trying to tell you. So they give you that. So they talk about that briefly. They talk about device selection. Going to be similar to what we talked about on the large ones, except that instead of having those large switches on it or the big routers on it, you're probably going to get a combined router switch wireless access point that is really probably more likely labeled as a DSL router or a cable modem, as a DSL modem or a cable modem or whatever on it, and that you're using that. But it's playing switch, router, and the whole bit on it, okay? Because actually with DSL or cable or whichever y'all are using, dial-up being the exception on it, because dial-up actually isn't doing a connection of networks together, but it's just extending out on it. But you're sitting there with a router connecting the outside network to your inside network. And that's what your DSL modem or your cable modem is sitting there and is really doing, is really not a modem. Dial-up, you really do have a modem because you're actually converting analog to digital. So she actually had a modem sitting there. Although she had a much modern box on it, so I'm still a little not exactly sure on it, but she had decent, I say it wasn't bad speed on it, but she wasn't. I downloaded just a small thing because I downloaded CCleaner and Avast. I guess that was it that I downloaded, and Super Anti-Spyware. And none of those took very long to download on it, so I'm not sure exactly what was going on. But she's probably been using AOL since AOL was the big thing out there. Just like my AT&T email account dates from back in '96, which is the time of AOL and actually the end of AOL's supreme reign, because AOL was really big there from probably '92 to 2000. And then as DSL arrived and the cable stuff arrived, that killed AOL. So they mention on concern on about when you're buying that stuff. Again, speed of ports would be important. Number of ports, what type of ports you've got. Typically wireless and wired on there. That they mentioned that you've got some things have got 10 gigabit ports on them now, and actually you'll see 40 gigabit coming out now too. Okay, for usages. Although primarily I'm still seeing the 1 gig, which is usually expressed as 1,000 meg, and that you'll see them having a 1,110 still on them. Although the 10 is starting to disappear off on the bottom end. Expandability, I would make sure you do have some expandability, just like on the large ones, because you don't know what additional devices you may want to plug into that thing, even though you may be using predominantly wireless. And IP addressing, they say you could do several different things on that. Typically, they're just going to use the private addresses, no, the public addresses. I get those two confused all the time. So that's going to use the 192.168, the 172 dot whatever, and the 10, which would all be privates. I don't know why I have a hard time with those. Because those are for private networks versus the others for your big public network. Redundancy, it would be good to have, but quite often in these small networks you're going to have no redundancy. Walmart may well be your redundancy. About knowing where can you go to buy the device again, or a device or two if something goes wrong with it, instead of having multiple devices sitting there, because it's a more significant percentage of what they're spending on it than on the large networks. And that if it's just those router switches, obviously we can go down to Walmart and buy a new one. And so that works as a backup for you on it. So they talk about that and mention a little bit on that you need to look at the real-time traffic of the voice and video and such things. But it's all the same type of things. The common applications and protocols would be the same as you've seen on the other, except for, and they don't really tell you this in the book, but I would tell you that if you look over there on page 542, they're showing you, it says network services there, the previous page says 11.6 shows you the protocols, and really what they're showing you there is servers, basically on it, okay? So they've got this catch-all picture there. But here's what I will tell you on this in terms of a small network versus your large ones. Your large networks would have all of those things. Your small network may well not have a lot of this stuff on it. DNS server, that's usually going to be pointing back to your ISP, and your ISP providing DNS services for you. So that's probably not going to be on your small network. Telnet, you're probably not going to use on the small network. So that one's going to be out, or the SSH, okay? Which is really what you want to use, not Telnet unless you're directly connected there. But remember, what's the difference between SSH and Telnet? What's the big difference between the two? Security encryption, because it's the encryption. SSH encrypts everything going across. Telnet is all plain text. So anybody can steal the information through Telnet. Okay? But Telnet's still used out there and still talked about extensively. It's just you really only want to use it if you're direct connected. Okay? You really don't want to go across the internet. Email server, you're probably not going to have that on your local network either. You're going to use some other email provider for it. And that you can go to Gmail and you can actually use your domain at Gmail and use addresses that go to your domain going through Gmail or through some of the other ones on it, and set it up, and that Gmail will actually let it set you up so that I could actually go to Gmail and set up addresses for dwightwatt.com. As it is, Rack 9 lets me do that anyway with forwarders from there, but Gmail would actually let me set actual addresses that it's stored by that address out there on Gmail, instead of using a Gmail address, but using Gmail. Similar to the school uses Microsoft for hosting our email, so that y'all's email accounts and the faculty email accounts are all kept at Microsoft. And so they're kept on their servers, not us. But on the home one, or the small network, you're very likely going to do that nowadays. Now, you did originally, if you go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, yes, you did try to do email service on the small network sometimes also, but not now. You're going to use one of those giants. DHCP server, that will actually be running there on your router modem. So that you would have. Web server, you're probably not going to be hosting a web page from your small network. If you do have your own, have a web page for that organization or that individual, like me as an individual having my web page, that you're going to host it out there somewhere else, not on a machine on your network. That you're going to buy hosting space from someplace else or be provided hosting space by someplace else. And then FTP server, you're probably not going to have that going there either. And that, so not much of that would really be on your small network. Does that make sense? Everybody? All right. Then they mention about that you got voice and video applications could be running across there too. Obviously, that would definitely be one that's running on like personal networks, because y'all at home are definitely probably doing some video type things on there. Some of you doing extensively, some of us not doing extensively, although I'm doing video actually thinking about it because I keep watching things, but not watching movies as such. And a lot of organizations and individual/families are doing voice over IP for home now too, because instead of you having a landline, that you're doing it through your computer on it, although it looks like a landline, operates like a landline for you still. Although in some cases, landlines are mandatory still for organizations. If you have an elevator at a company, you have to have a landline that connects to that elevator by Georgia law. That's so if somebody gets trapped on the elevator, they can call for help. And the law still says it has to be a landline. Okay, I assume they'll change that at some point. And it could have even been changed in the legislature this year, and you not be aware of it. But I know a year or two ago that was still the law. The 6th Cavalry Museum, when they went and remodeled and got their upstairs as a banquet area and stuff, and had to put an elevator in, obviously, to do that, to make regular use of it. When they went to put the elevator in, that it was pointed out to them by the fire marshal, I think it was, that you got to have a landline that goes specifically to this elevator. And it has to be a landline, that you can't do it through voice over IP or a cellular connection there. And then they mentioned that design it so it can scale on up. So ideally, if you've got it set right, that you'll be able to scale it as the growth occurs. Then they go into network security, and that's probably the more interesting part of the whole chapter for you, and they spend a whole bunch of time on that one. But we've talked about all of this stuff before. They talk about how the types of threats that are out there of trying to steal stuff or disrupt your services. They mention physical security, and that there on the small networks tends to not be emphasized as much, because you usually don't lock your network devices up in a separate room in the small networks. that they're more sitting out there open. At home, it's secure for the fact you don't hardly let anybody into your house, and if it's just sitting there in the living room or whatever, which is where it is in a lot of cases, where your router device is, you've got control on who comes in the house and that you don't just let anybody wander in the house. So it really is behind a locked door. In small organizations, you will quite often find that that router box is sitting right there under the desk of the receptionist up there, and that it's just sitting right out there in the open right there, except for that the receptionist, he or she, is normally up there, so it's controlled anyway. Or that it's sitting back in somebody's office that may sit open regularly all day. So you don't always see that really secured quite as well in the small organization. But it's a more trusting environment in the small organization too, because you know, everybody knows who should be wandering around in the offices in there. Okay? So if somebody's walked in that doesn't belong in there, everybody knows that person don't belong in there. Where when you get to the large place, no, they don't know. And just like you heard me just tell Dr. Fennell, I really don't know the names of all of these nursing instructors. And yeah, most of them work down the hall from me. Okay? But I don't know their names on it. I know who a number of them are to recognize if I see them walking along or go in a room to go, wait a minute, that one probably should be because I've seen them around. But I may not have identification. But if, like when I was teaching at Swainsboro Tech, we were still the size of these back buildings here, up here. And this would have been the same way at this school when it was just those back buildings on it. That when you only had 600 students in the school or so, and only had 20, 25 employees, people knew who people were in the building. And so some of that security wasn't quite as needing to be quite as tight on it, because you knew if you saw somebody walk in a room that didn't belong there, it stood out to everybody. Where the larger one, you know, now, we don't know who in the world's all wandering around here. And whether you're in here for malicious reasons or you're here to get an education. Well, you may be here for both. I don't know. So they talk about, so they mention about that and about electrical threats, etc. And I mentioned we already had an electrical threat today here, that the entire power went out this morning. Either from somebody running into the power pole down there or from them putting the new power pole in out there just down the street. Probably one of those two things is what knocked it out there. So you need to be aware on all of that also. And in the smaller one, it's usually not quite as big of a item on it as in the larger network. That things get, the power goes out, it's not as big of a problem on them that they sit there and sit there and talk about it, and that there's not any major losses occurring. When in a large organization, it may well be a bunch of sales are occurring and everything else, and if you've lost the power and you didn't have backup on the web server, you're losing sales. Then they talk about the vulnerabilities, TCP/IP protocol weaknesses, and we've talked about those already. The operating system weaknesses, we've talked about those. And like on Windows 10, the 1809 update had all kinds of problems on it, and it is out there now, supposedly, that Microsoft says they finally got it working and out there, but it appears everybody's going to skip it and just go on to 1903. That is coming out this week and next week being released. Now, remember those numbers on there, the first two numbers are the year, the second two numbers, the third and fourth numbers are the month that it was supposed to be released in. Remember, we're at the end of 04 and going into 05 now. But it will be 1903 is the release, because it was really supposed to have come out in March originally. 1809 was September of last year. It really didn't get released till the end of October. and got pulled within a week because all of a sudden there was a numerous reports of people reporting that it was deleting their data. So they pulled it, then they released it the end of November, and it goofed up some more things. Then they pulled it again and released it, I think, like the end of January, had a few other glitches in it, pulled it, and now say they've got it pretty well smoothed out. But you've scared off everybody effectively from it by now anyway. So they might as well have skipped it, and that's essentially what the publications are saying Microsoft is more or less doing on that one. Theoretically, you've got updates to Windows 10 coming out twice a year, and they really intended it to be March and September. And notice that's a 6-month time period. But almost always, since they've been trying to do that, they've been at least a month or two behind. Or they really pushed it in trying to get it into that month and released it like on the last day of the month. And now they've sort of even given up on that idea. But when you look at the updates on it, that's when they tell you, and I don't know why they could have just as easily have stayed with going with their other numbering system still. And so instead of saying those numbers on Windows 10, gone with that we would be on Windows 15 or something now. But it's doing it as a service. So then they talk about some other pieces on that. Talk about the types of network attacks. They give you a discussion again about viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. And distinguishing between viruses and worms is always confusing. But viruses stick themselves into another program, but worms replicate themselves from machine to machine. Okay, essentially, although you're sort of seeing between the two, so it's not always real clear on those. Trojan horses are programs that get stuck out there and could be like on a virus, stuck in a program, or it could be a separate program out there that it's some code that executes at some certain point in the future. It could be on a time basis, or it could be when a signal comes from the mothership. Okay? And that it proceeds to do its thing at that point. It could be as a bot to attack other places, or it could be that it attacks that machine. But that's the Trojan horses. They talk about the reconnaissance attacks, and that they're going out and just trying to find what's wrong, weaknesses, etc. on your system, and that they do things along that line. And then the access attacks where they're trying to get into stuff on your machine. And then they mentioned the denial of service attacks, which I've mentioned to you all semester. They could be DOS attacks, or it could be DDoS attacks. And that's where it's attacking either your machine or your network so that you can't use that machine or network. That it's tied up dealing with other stuff. And that's where I talked about you could do a ping attack on it and do tons of pings at it, and the pings, remember, are high priority, and so it can't do what it's supposed to be doing. You could tie it up in other ways. And that was one of the things I was sort of looking at when I was working on that machine I mentioned to y'all a little bit ago down the road here, because the lady had called me because her hard drive was full. And when I mentioned it to a couple of people, it may not be really her hard drive, it's probably her OneDrive is full. Well, I got there and looked. It was really her hard drive was full. But she had a full C drive, which was a 250 gig drive. And it was literally full. When I got there and went to starting on it, it had 10 meg, I think, available on it. And the number dropped all the way down to 0 on me as I'm examining it. So it was literally full, and I've really not seen a C drive literally full before. And then listening to her, what she did, and looking at it as it was still running. It was sluggish. So I'm looking at it and looking what she had on it, and I'm going, well, she doesn't really do anything on it other than she had, like I say, she told me she used the browser and the email. And that was about all that I found on there. And then when I tried to start finding where it was eating it all up, it wouldn't let me into the temp folder for some reason that was blocking. And so I deleted off some things that she had on there, removed a couple of programs that I knew she really didn't need, because she had malware bytes on there, she had a VAST on there, which really wasn't working because of it, but she had a VAST, but she had malware bytes, and I was going, well, malware bytes wasn't really doing her any good, because she didn't know to run that thing anyway. And malware bytes, unless you've got the bot version of malware bytes, it does not do any monitoring. If you've got the free version, you have to go in there and actually tell it to do it every time. Now, it does a real good job when you do that. There's a good program on that. And it will get some stuff off your machine that others won't get off. But the free version does not do any monitoring, watching, or even automatic scans, where the others almost all do. So I pulled a couple other things that weren't needed on there, and got a little bit of space and stuck CCleaner on there and ran the disk cleaner utility of it. And it told me that it had found in the log files in the temp folder, there was 173 gig of files sitting there. I have no idea in the world what they were or why they built up to that size on it, but they were there. And it removed them. I couldn't get to them because it said I didn't have the right security for it. But it got rid of them, and lo and behold, now she has 75% of her hard drive available. So it cured the problem. And then I was able to, then I had to remove a VAST, reinstall a VAST, because with that limited space, they just hadn't done correctly on it. And I put super anti-spyware on there too, because I really thought there may well be some malware or something that was eating stuff up out there, but nothing found anything out there, so I left and she was happy. Actually, she had me clean another machine too. So be aware of those, and so on that. Then they talk about how to mitigate your network attacks. They mention backup, making sure you do your backups regularly, which I don't even know if they got it as a heading for the section, but they don't even mention it down in the section right there. But do back up your material, even on your personal computers at home. I'd make sure you have a backup of your pictures and your documents, okay? Somewhere. If you've got them stored on the machine there, store them out there in the cloud, for instance. Put them on your free OneDrive space or Google Drive, or out there at Shutterfly or Google Photos or wherever, okay? Or store them onto DVDs, okay? And then they mention about upgrades. Do your upgrades regularly, your updates and your patches, which we really talked about already a few pages back. So I talked about there on the Windows updates. Do those regularly. Windows 10, though, until just now with 1903, it actually changes. It started changing slightly in 1809, but it really takes effect in 1903. That you can actually now turn off updates on Windows 10, so it doesn't do them as soon as it finds it out there and goes and does it. Used to be you could only put it off. What they'd put in before was you could put it off for 30 days. What they originally had was you had no control on it. It did it when it wanted to do it. Now they're giving you more and more control back on it, because Microsoft has learned that that does not work well for a lot of people, and y'all may well have run into, just like me, that there's been some times when it's decided it wanted to do an update was not a good time to do an update. My church computer it went and did an update Sunday morning for me at 11 o'clock, right when church started. and I couldn't show the video stuff up on the screen until it got through 5 minutes later. The machine had tied itself up on that and locked me out. And I'm going, this is not good. The thing's only used basically it's only used about 3 hours a week, and it decided it had to be done in those 3 hours. And that we're using it for full functionality then. They talk about authentication, authorization, and accounting again. We've mentioned that before. Just mention it again to you, the AAA there, because those are 3 letters that are important to you on it. And particularly those of you that are in cyber, you'll see that continuously come on up. Authentication says it's identified you, it knows you are who you are. Okay? Password is the most common way of doing authentication. It could be iris scan, it could be fingerprint, obviously. Some of y'all's laptops now and even some phones are using fingerprint. Okay? Not too much on the iris scans, but iris scans always seems to get stories. Okay? It could be some other type things on it, or that you use the picture identification, or how you run your finger back and forth across the screen to unlock it is an authentication piece there too. That is something you know that you're doing, okay? And all that's establishing is the computer has established you are who you're supposed to be, okay? There's a way of knowing that. Second one is authorization. That's giving you authorization to use different resources that are on that computer. Okay? Think about Banner. Or think about Blackboard. Let's use Blackboard. And Banner is just my GNTC. Now we do it as my GNTC at school, but still Banner is a real program. But Blackboard, it authenticates you when you log on, because you have to put in your password and username. So now it knows who you are. Okay? You've established who you are. And then it gives you a list of courses. It only authorizes you to go into certain courses. You don't get to go into all courses. You can only go into certain courses and access certain things in that class. Okay? She can only access her grades. You can only access your grades. Does that make sense? So that's what authorization is. I don't get to go in all of Blackboard either. I can only go into my classes and do stuff in them. Okay? I can't go into other instructors' classes. Well, actually, I told you I've got to review these classes. Actually, I get authority to go into some more through that. Okay? That most instructors around here, except for the handful of us that are special, are very limited on it. But I have to log on as somebody else to do that. I can't even go in it as Dwight Watt. I have to go in it as a reviewer. And that goes with the third part, accounting. It keeps log files out there about who's been in there and what people did. And in Blackboard, some of the students have learned along the way, after they apparently didn't think about that it would do it, that it was doing accounting. That's not accounting in terms of what this classroom normally is. That's in terms of just keeping records of what went on in the machine. Okay? So it actually has out there, we can go look up as instructors. I can go look up and see, when did y'all go into Blackboard? When have you been in there? How long were you in there? It tells me, when did you take the test? When did you turn in work? And all of that. And that's all a part of accounting. Does that make sense? And so then we've got a record of it all. Likewise, they can tell when I go in. So if something goes wrong out there, they can go, you were the one that did it at that point. Even though I tried to claim I didn't. And then they talk about firewalls. You've got those from real fancy standalone devices, which some of those can be small ones. Because actually the Palo Alto ones, we've got one over on the other campus, is about that big. So if you think about the size of your modem boxes or your router box that y'all got at home, it's about the same size as that. And that's a full function physical firewall. So they mentioned the Cisco ones. Palo Alto is the leading maker of firewalls out there for networks. They don't mention them because of competition. And then they mention about you could have a firewall on your server and be passing the stuff through there. Your routers, your wireless routers, or even your wired routers, your small little routers that you've got, come with a firewall built in them, and y'all can go in and change settings on them. And then you've got your own, what they call personal firewalls, which are the software firewalls on your individual PCs. Windows comes with a Windows Defender firewall on it, which is a decent firewall. It's really a good, decent firewall sitting there that's already on Windows. Okay? You can also go out and buy firewalls from others. Avast will be happy to sell you a firewall as part of their security suite. Norton will, McAfee will. Malwarebytes, I'm pretty sure does. All of them have firewalls out there besides their antivirus product. Okay? And so those work on that way. And then they go through and they talk about passwords, which we talked about before, about how to set those up. I would read the last little bullet under passwords carefully, because you get to read the whole thing, not just the first phrase. Because the first phrase used to be what they said as the comment there, but that's not true anymore. Now they tell you can write your passwords down. Just don't keep them with the computer, and don't have them completely identifying the website they associate with. Okay? Or like if it's the password to get on that computer, you want to have it somewhere else or have it something different about it, but you could put it in your wallet, for instance, and carry it around with you. And that it be there, but it's not identifying that that's your password to get into the school's network, and so if somebody stole it, it doesn't get them anywhere on. So as many passwords as we all have to have nowadays, you've got to write them down. Password managers are out there, but I'm very weary of those, because then somebody's going to hack them at some point, and I can guarantee you people are out there trying to hack them right now. Okay? When they do, they're going to have the password to everything for those people and be able to get into stuff. So one of the things I see is there's going to be a problem one day. Exactly when it happens, I don't know. Just like the cloud, when one of the major cloud centers, something happens to it, of what happens. So they go through those. So you can write them down, but don't leave them in an obvious place where it's obvious what it belongs with. But you could find a password laying on my desk there in my office, but it's not the one that gets you into here. You can try it. It won't work. But it gets you into some site, but I don't have it really told to you what it goes with. So it doesn't do you any good, because after all, read all instructions could be his password. Okay? And written in big bold letters up there on the wall. But none of us would know that. So they talk some about that. They did talk about the SSH then at that end. And then they go into the Cisco devices and go through a few things on that. They mention about how to back up and restore the config files on there, and they go through and tell you about a number of ways you can do that. Remember, on the modern ones, it's actually keeping it on the flash memory on it, and on the newest routers and switches, remember I showed you down there in the classroom that it's just on a little flash card, and that you can just pop that card out of there. So you could obviously keep some more of those cards around and keep a set of cards off at an off-site location as your backup for it. Or you could go through the TFTP or the other ways that they show you here. So they show you some other ways to do it through there and take a number of pages showing you on that. Or you could send it out through the USB port also on the newer ones that have those on. The old routers and switches from Cisco did not have either of those things available. Then they talk about the ping command as far as testing and verifying your network. We've talked about it already before, and it's a way for you to make sure your other devices are actually connectable to you. And then they mentioned the extended ping. I've mentioned that to you before also on the Cisco devices. This is not on Windows. Windows just does the 5 pings when you do a ping. 4 or 5, I can't remember if it's 4 or 5. It's either 4 or 5 that it sends out. I think it's 5, but it's one of the two. Cisco has an extended ping, and you can actually ping from somewhere else to somewhere else. You don't have to ping from where you are. Or on Windows, you can just ping from where you are to someplace. The other one is you can do on Cisco, you can tell it how many pings you want it to send. So you're not limited to that 4 or 5 rule. If you want to send 100 of them out at that machine, you can. Okay? Windows tells you whether it was successful or not, each of them. And it's clear on it, it tells you, and gives you the time it took to get there and back. If you have a failure on the first one, as y'all probably know by now, don't worry about that one if the others work. It's just trying to establish its trail. It didn't work real well the first try, but then it had it and you're good and going. So just be aware on those. On the Cisco, it's not going to give you a whole wording thing out. It's just going to give you a period or a U. So you're going to get this little row of periods and U's. If you get all periods right there, that's good. You made contact on every one of the pings that was sent. If you get a U, that was an unsuccessful one. And that's what U is, unsuccessful. Okay? So, and again, if it was U, period, 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 you're good. But it was just the first one failed for some reason. Probably just trying to make its connection getting out of the machine. Trace route is then mentioned about. We've talked about that one before. Trace, R-O-U-T-E, on the Linux Unix machines. Trace RT on Windows DOS machines. And that's just taking the ping command a little bit further, that it tells you every router it crosses on the way there. So it gives you a little more detail. Then they go through and they talk about the show commands. I told you back at the very beginning of the book that show was going to be your best friend. And at this point, you'll probably figured out for sure show run is a real good friend of yours. Okay? That you've used it numerous times as you've been setting things up there in Packet Tracer. Well, they show you a number of other shows here. Show interfaces, tells you about each of your interfaces, but gives you a whole lot of stuff on it. Show IPINT brief is a better one than show interfaces, unless you want all the little details. Because it will just tell you each of your interfaces and whether they're up and up, down and down, or whatever combination. And remember, you want them up and up. You want status up, which means there's a physical connection, and you want protocol up, which means that there's a protocol actually able to talk back and forth between the two devices. Okay? So they show ARP, show version. And then they mention about the ipconfig command. It is ipconfig in Windows. On Linux and Unix, it's what? ifconfig. Or what's the new command that actually Linux uses instead of ifconfig? It actually uses IP. That is a command now that does what ipconfig does. Okay? And that they're actually deprecating ifconfig. And ifconfig is the grandfather of them all, because ipconfig was built off of ifconfig. And now there's just IP, which is a whole lot shorter and easier to type. Then they mentioned show CDP neighbors, which will tell you about all the other routers connected to your router. So that gives you a little more on that one. And then they get down to the very end. They mention the debug command. If you use the debug command, it is very verbose, which means it produces tons of information. You want to turn it off as soon as you've gotten the amount of information you need. You don't want to run debug running all the time on a Cisco device. Or you will end up with a case of what I just had to go do last week. You will have a filled up machine that will fill up their storage with a ton of information. It'll tell you every little thing that's happening out there on that device. So you just want to run it for a short time to find what you're looking for in there. You don't want to run it continuous. So they introduce you to that one. And then they mention about their troubleshooting approach, which they do as a 6-step one. Identify the problem's first one, because whoever told you something's wrong is just going to say there's something wrong with it. So you got to identify the problem, figure out what is actually going wrong. And those of you that have written me with problems in the class know that I do that one first. Because, David, I wrote you this morning on the one you wrote me about. And wrote back and said, I need to see something else on it to identify it better. And then establish a theory of the probable causes, that once you see what really is the problem, that you see what's happening, then you want to figure out what's the cause of it, which is what y'all are really always writing me wanting, because that's what you wrote and asked me really wanting to know, right? So figure out what's the probable cause of it, and then test that, figure out if that you did have the right cause, and then establish a plan of action. And so that's what are we going to do to take care of it, to fix it. And that's really what y'all want when you're writing. Although I sort of make you go through the second part of figuring out exactly what it is. So then establish a plan of action and then implement that solution. And then fifth step is to verify the full system functionality. Make sure everything is now working. And that's a problem Microsoft has failed to do sometimes on their updates. They went and did something that was going to fix some stuff, but they failed to verify the full system worked correctly then, and that it blew up. And so they started deleting people's data. Something they did caused something else, and they were thought. And then the last step is document it, so that you can find it again. So, and then they talk about resolve or escalate. If this is a small network, probably escalate may not be an option, or if escalate is where you hire somebody to come in and fix it, or you pick up the phone and call the help desk, help center. Okay? That if it's a small organization and you're the computer person there and you're fixing it, if you go to escalate the problem, that just means that you just took it out of this hand and put it into this hand to work on it. Because there's nobody else for you to pass it on up to. You're the expert present. Okay? So you got to resolve it in the end. And then they mention about duplex again. We talked about that earlier in the back book, about half duplex and full duplex. And that actually you got to have them both ends working the same way. So if it's one of the ends has to work at half duplex, the other end has to work at half duplex, because they can't communicate if they're trying to do both things on the same channel. Because remember, half duplex says one end can send and the other end can't send while that one's sending. Full duplex says both ends can send at the same time. And remember, my example on that was full duplex is a telephone call, half duplex is CB radio or ham radio. Okay? And then they mention about IP addressing, that you could have problems on that. And default gateway, sometimes that's a problem if they're trying to get out. Can't get out onto the internet, is the default gateway was not set up correctly. And so there's no way out of your network out into the real world. And that there is a chapter. And again, it took me about 1 hour yesterday and about 1 hour today to go through it. So Thursday, we will do the cabling. And if you get the cabling done on Thursday, you don't have to come back Tuesday. And then next Thursday, we will not have class because I will not be here. And if they go and take my classroom that day, I'll never know about them taking it that day. Any questions?